Thank you very much, and I feel very honored to have these two gentlemen here to talk to you tonight. They have been members of our Japanese American community who have been very well respected and honored because of the work that they've done in civil rights and in social justice issues. So I'm very pleased to have both of them here, and I'll give you a little introduction to each one of them. The Honorable Raymond S. Uno. Ray will be, his son says, 81 years old this year. I don't know if you wanted everyone to know that, Ray, but that's what Kai gave me.
I am 81. I'm going to be 82.
Will be 82. He was born in Ogden, Utah, and attended Ogden High School and Weber Junior College. His first job, actually, was as a dishwasher at age 14 at Heart Mountain, Wyoming concentration camp, where he lost his father while they were interned. He was the age of 12 when his father passed away. He and his family were incarcerated for 3 years there during World War II. At the age of 17, he entered military service. Graduated from the Military Intelligence Language School at the Presidio, Monterey, California, specializing in Japanese language, and was sent overseas to Japan, and was attached to the 319th Military Intelligence Unit and the 441st Counterintelligence Corps as a special agent, discharged after 4 years of a Korean War vet. He has worked as a social worker, juvenile court, Salt Lake County attorney, assistant Utah Attorney General. He was in private legal practice, a court judge, the State Circuit Court judge, and became the first and only elected minority in the 3rd District State Court judge in 1984, and was senior 3rd District Court judge. Ray is now retired, but he's very active in many organizations, as he has been throughout his life. For over 55 years, he's been active in a number of community organizations. He was also the president of the Japanese American Citizens League, which is the oldest and longest-lived Japanese American organization with civil rights in the United States. And he was the president of our organization. It's the Omaha chapter of the JACL that's helping to sponsor this event. Bill Yoshino is the Midwest director of the Japanese American Citizens League. He manages the JACL national programs related to education, leadership development, discrimination, and hate crimes. In Illinois, Mr. Yoshino has served on the Illinois Asian American Advisory Council to the governor. He has served on the Asian American Advisory Councils to 3 Chicago mayors, has served as a member of the Chicago Commission on Human Relations, the Illinois Commission on Discrimination and Hate Crimes, and the Cook County Hate Crimes Prosecution Council. Through the years, he has responded to numerous incidences of defamation and hate crimes that have occurred in Chicago and around the nation. He has produced a variety of anti-hate materials distributed by the JACL. He continues to present hate crime workshops on college campuses as part of the JACL leadership program. Mr. Yoshino has testified before the United States Judiciary Committee on Hate Crime Statistics Act in 1988 and the U.S. House Committee on Interior and Insular Affairs on the Japanese American National Historic Landmark Theme Study Act in 1991. In addition, he testified before the Illinois Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and on issues of discrimination, and before the committees in the Illinois House on issues affecting Asian Americans in Illinois. I'm very proud to present these two gentlemen to you as our panel. We'll go through a number of questions that they'll respond to, giving information about the redress and reparations issue and talking a little bit about their own personal stories with it. So I would like to start first by giving you just a general framework of what we're going to talk about, and then the questions will appear on the screen, and then you'll hear their responses to those questions. These are very general in terms of the outline because they will be giving you more specific details. February 19, 1942 is when Executive Order 9066 was signed by Roosevelt. And it's because of that that we celebrate the Day of Remembrance across the country at this particular time of year. So we get as close to February 19th as we can And this year, it's the 23rd. Ray Uno was very busy in Salt Lake City with their Day of Remembrance that time. And so he was able to come out during this time, so very happy that he could make it here. So that's the time, the executive order is when the president signed the executive order that gave permission to the military to then begin rounding up the Japanese Americans and those parents, their parents who could not be American citizens because of laws that were in the United States that didn't allow them to become citizens. So rounded them up from the West Coast and put them into the camps. July 2nd, 1948, after the camps were over, after the war was done, Congress passes the Japanese American Claims Act. And this act enabled Japanese Americans to receive some compensation for what they had lost, but only property, and only about 10 cents on the dollar. And there was a maximum amount that each one could have. So they may talk a little bit about that. But that passed in 1948. Some people will say, well, didn't this happen long ago? Didn't they get paid already for something before the Redress and Reparations Act came about? But that was what they got paid for back in 1948. Then during the 70s, a number of different groups formed across the United States. The JACL had committees that were formed. There were a number of other groups that formed in other parts of the country to discuss the whole idea of redress and reparations and whether there was something that they could do going to the government to redress the wrongs that had occurred to the citizens. Not all were in agreement with each other on what direction to take. So there were a number of groups formed, a number of different discussions. By 1980, Congress did pass an act to begin down one of those paths, and you'll hear about that. And then by 1988, 8 years later, Reagan signed H.R. 442, the Civil Liberties Act. So that's just the general idea. So you kind of have an idea of where we're going with this, what started all of this with the 9066, and then how it progressed up the Civil Liberties Act. I would then now like to turn to our speakers to address some of the questions we have. Events occurred that led to the beginning conversations among Japanese Americans and with other organizations to work toward gaining support for national reparations for individuals impacted by the mass incarceration.
I guess I'll start this off, Ray. I'd first of all like to thank Creighton University, Ricardo, Sharon, for the invitation here this evening. Very oftentimes when we commemorate these days of remembrance events, we generally talk about the internment or the incarceration itself, the events that led up to it, that sort of thing. This is actually the very first occasion I've had to kind of focus not on the internment itself, but to take a look at the whole effort to find some sort of a remedy for what took place during that, those horrible and tragic years of the 1940s. And this is the very first time I've had the pleasure, too, of being on a panel with Raymond Uno, a very distinguished, as Sharon has mentioned, leader within the Japanese American community nationally. This very first question having to do with the various events that occurred, conversations and so forth leading up to this whole movement toward Japanese, and we called this the Redress campaign, by the way. So if I use the term redress, that's what the reference is to. I think that question is a good one. I think too that there are actually other questions that kind of play off of this, because very oftentimes people ask the question, why did it take so long, for example, to even embark upon these campaigns to try to get redress or try to find ways to remedy what took place in 1942, because the actual events themselves, that is the efforts that were made through Congress. There was also an effort to try to file a lawsuit, actually, that found its way through the various courts. All of this happened during the 1980s. So we're talking about here are efforts that didn't materialize until 40 years after or 35 years after the event itself. And I think that that's probably key to this whole discussion, simply because I guess as I look at the reasons for that, it's probably because of the great trauma that those who were affected by this government action during the 1940s had to go through. It was that plus two, I think it had to do with folks wanting to kind of get on with their lives after World War II, to go back to their homes in some cases, or to find new homes if they went to new cities in the Midwest or on the East Coast. But in any event, the times just simply wasn't ripe for them to engage in an effort that was going to really shine the light, so to speak, on the community again. There, as Sharon had mentioned in the outline, were some events that did take place that attempted to find ways to remedy what took place. One of the events was in 1948. It was called the Evacuation Claims Act, which actually was a piece of legislation that was initiated by the Japanese American Citizens League to find ways to compensate people for personal and real property that they had lost. It became a situation where folks actually had to file claims and so forth, show proof, and so it became kind of complicated by the fact that a lot of folks weren't able to come up with this kind of a documentation. And after a period of time, actually, the whole process for filing these claims and the bureaucracy that had to be put in place actually became more expensive than the amount of monies that they eventually compensated people who made claims for. I believe the claims extended into the 1950s, and Ray Uno can probably enlighten us a little bit more about that. But in any event, it was an attempt, but it wasn't an attempt really to look at individual compensation to an extent in terms of property, personal and real property. Beyond that, there were other efforts within the Japanese American community to look at other issues that the community thought was actually much more pressing, rather than looking at this whole notion of compensation or remedial action. One of them was that Japanese who had immigrated to this country around the turn of the century weren't able to become naturalized as citizens. And so the community felt that it was really important to tackle that kind of an issue first. And so in 1952, the Walter McCarran Act was passed, which gave naturalization rights finally to Japanese. I think that Japanese actually were the last group who were able to become naturalized. And so, we're talking about fairly recent history, 1952. I think one of the key events in American history actually that had a great impact on the Japanese American community moving forward on this was actually the Civil Rights Movement during the 1960s. I think that just seeing that rights were being given or rights were being fought for during that period of time, I think gave a certain amount of motivation and strength to the Japanese American community to really maybe take a look at doing something on our own to remedy all of this. And in fact, in 1970, at a national convention of the Japanese American Citizens League, a resolution was put forward actually by a relative, a cousin of Ray Uno's, a fellow named Edison Uno, who was an activist, a community activist living in San Francisco, and he brought a resolution saying that we needed to take action and to find a resolution to what took place. And then every 2 years thereafter, for 3 years, that same kind of a resolution was brought to the National JACL until finally in 1978, a concrete proposal was put forward saying that what we needed to do was to find a way to compensate people for what took place during those years. And the proposal asked for an amount of $25,000 and then per individual, and then I believe it was like $100 million trust fund set up to benefit the community. I'm going to stop there and let Ray kind of fill in, I think, some of the details here, and we'll just simply go from there.
Okay. I just kind of wrote down some notes that I picked up, and Bill and I kind of talked over a few things, and I told him, you go first, because last night I went first, and normally a judge has the last say, so I thought I'd follow up on that. But in 1946, they had a campaign for repeal of California alien land law, but a lot of people didn't know that there were over 500 different laws and all kinds of ordinances and things that were anti-Japanese or Asian. And a lot of those things had to eventually be repealed one after the other. But that was a piecemeal thing that the Japanese community had to do. And as I was talking with Bill, JSL played a very prominent part in that. And not just because I've been affiliated and I was a national president, but just observing everything that I have observed, JSL was the nucleus of most of these activities. And so, you know, we're trying to strive to keep doing this kind of thing, and we're very appreciative, again, of your chapter putting on this Day of Remembrance. And I, like Bill, appreciate being here to try to discuss this matter, which is very important to all of us. And then he also mentioned the 1948 Evacuees Claim Act, which paid out $38 million, which is very insufficient when you consider we went way over 1-point-some-odd billion when we finally settled this thing. And then he talked about the naturalization and the McCarran Act. And it was 1968, I went to a national convention in San Jose. And at that time, I think I was a parliamentarian. My memory is so bad I can't remember what position I was playing, but a fellow named Edison Uno, who happened to be my cousin, walked onto the council floor, and he first proposed, and this is the first time I heard about the word reparation. And, you know, I didn't even know what he was asking for, but he was asking for redress. And so that's the first that I heard. And then after that, of course, he brought it, as I mentioned, to the council floor. And, you know, one of the things I thought sort of gave impetus to a lot of things is this repeal of Title II of the Internal Security Act of 1950, which now is a big issue, you know, with they're detaining people on suspicion. And that was, Title II had this little provision in there that said the same thing. And Raymond Okamura and my cousin Edison Uno headed the committee to repeal that. And at that time, it was just like this evacuee claims. They said, no way you can do it, you know. We're a small organization. How can you repeal something in Congress when you have to get all those Congress people to pass something? Edison Uno and Raymond Okamura started organizing. And this is the first time, I think, that we organized nationally, you know, where we got the support of everybody. And I think that was sort of the impetus to do things on a national level, and they were very successful. They won. And so American Civil Liberties Union, all these civil liberties groups said, wow, you know, JSL, a small group like that was able to do something like this. So when this came about, you know, a lot of people were surprised, but some of us that have been on the lower level from a long time ago said, you know, it can be done because we did it on a small thing, and we have this organization to do it. So that was one of the things that, you know, took place. And from 68 to 70, I was the National Civil Rights Coordinator, and I traveled all over the country and trying to talk people into civil rights. And I found out Japanese were very conservative people. I mean, some places they threaten me. They say, "Hey, man, stay away from that. You know, we don't want you to get involved in it." And so it was kind of a tough situation, and we were successful in doing a lot of things in terms of civil rights, but to trying to get people in the rural areas like Fresno, that Central California, they are the people who do, you know, sort of like the breadbasket of the United States. They grow a lot of things there, and these people had just gotten out of the camps and they were just getting reestablished, and so they worked very hard to get their farms going. And these young Japanese Americans, the Sansei and the third generation, were very, very pro civil rights, and they were pro Chavez, you know, that was heading the farm workers. And one of them had this big picture of Chavez on his wall, and some of these Central Chavez people went in there and said, "What's that doing up there?" And I had to explain to them, "Hey, wait a minute, we have a lot of young people here that are very active, and they want to make some changes." So things like that were taking place at the same time. But it sort of organized and sort of, in a way, made a lot of the people that were neutral a little more positive in terms of civil rights. And although they may have opposed it, at least they were exposed to it. And so this kind of thing, you know, I think helped a little bit.
Yeah, I'd pick up on just you know, a couple of things that Ray mentioned. Is that, you know, it's one thing to have an issue out there and then to try to run it through Congress because you know you're going to run into obstacles, that sort of thing. But just in trying to get the community, the Japanese American community, together on this was a challenge in itself, and I think that's what Ray is trying to say. I remember, for example, after the JACL put the proposal out there to ask for $25,000 per individual in a trust fund, that there was a Japanese American actually sitting in the Senate, S.I. Hayakawa, and when he heard that, he said, "This is the most absurd, ridiculous thing that I've ever heard. You're not acting Japanese," he said. And so, you know, it's that kind of obstacle or dissension, even within your own community, among leadership at a very high level, and you have to go through guys like Hayakawa in order to get this thing done. So it wasn't an easy first step when folks who are very visible like that come out opposed to you.
So what timeline was anticipated and ultimately completed from the beginning to the end of the Reparations initiative?
Gosh, I don't know that, I think that for a lot of folks who are involved, it's not as though an actual timeline was put in place, because I think for a lot of those who were part of the entire, the JACL structure at least, they weren't all that optimistic in terms of the chances of something like that in the first place. So I think trying to put a timeline on it would have probably not been the best thing to do. I guess one of the other parts of this, though, is that there were folks who were trying to make steps or trying to do things in terms of introducing legislation, that type of thing, on their own. As I mentioned, the entire Japanese American community wasn't really totally together on all of this. The Japanese American Citizens League actually polled its various chapters around the country just to get a sense of whether or not the membership would accept this type of step, because they knew that by going with a congressional campaign on redress, it would put the community it would give the community a very high profile, which some folks didn't want to see. At the same time, you had some groups in Seattle who were actually very anxious to get moving on this. And I believe it was right around 1979, 1980, they decided that they wanted to put a bill in Congress, so they asked their local legislators, a fellow named Mike Lowry, a representative in Congress, to put in a direct compensation bill. And that wasn't something that the JACL necessarily wanted, because by that time, our organization had decided that it was going to go in a different direction. Rather than asking for a direct compensation bill, we decided that we would put a bill in Congress that would establish a federal commission to first look into the whole notion of what took place during World War II. So it was a very different approach. Ours was a more long-term approach. We knew it would take longer because a commission would take a couple of years before they could go through their entire processes, which would include hearings and so forth. And the reason why the JACL went in that direction was because, well, number one, it was at the urging of four very influential people in the Japanese American community. One was Senator Daniel Inouye, another was Senator Spark Matsunaga, and then two members of Congress, Norman Mineta and Robert Matsui. In fact, they met with the leadership of the JACL, I think it was back in about 1979 or so, to try to sit down to figure out how it was that we were going to tackle this whole notion of trying to find some remedies for this. And it was actually Dan Inouye who sat the group down and said, fellas, what do you think about a commission approach? And it wasn't so much that Dan Inouye was asking the question. I think what he was really doing was saying, this is the direction we are going to go. I think Dan knew that his fellow colleagues in the Senate and the members of the House of Representatives, and for that matter, the American public, weren't knowledgeable at all about this whole episode of American history. So his rationale was that you had to first educate if you're going to get folks to come along on this particular issue. So the JACL then decided to go with this so-called study commission. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but again, kind of bounce over to Ray here.
Along that line, he mentioned that the four congressmen that met with the JACL leaders, and at that time, Daniel Inouye suggested maybe we ought to kind of study this thing and form a commission. And at that time, John Tateshi was the head of the National JACL Redress Committee, and Clifford Ueda was the president. And as he walked out, John Tateshi says, well, I think we got the message for our walking orders, when he mentioned that, because Danny Inouye was a very powerful man in the Senate even at that time. So that's probably led to the commission form. But a lot of people are opposed to that commission. And so, as it was mentioned, there are different groups that were involved. And some of them they said, the Issei, the first generation, they're all old, they're all dying. Something like, I don't know how many hundred a day were dying, and they needed to get some kind of redress for these people. So this group, and there are a couple other groups that, were actively involved in this, and most of them wanted to have something done right now, not wait, because it says, how long is it going to take if you form a commission? Years and years. And so actually we had no timeline. It was just, how long is it going to take to get the commission? Then how long is it going to take for the commission to get the fact-finding done? Then what recommendations are they going to make? And we had no idea what was going to happen, what the commission was going to recommend. So it was something that everybody was kind of playing by ear, hoping that it could be done right away. And they made it as soon as they possibly could, just based on the events that took place and as we'll go along, we'll show you what transpired in terms of the things that happened that permitted this group of people and the J-Cell and the other groups to coalesce and achieve this amazing success story that, I was telling him, I can't believe what they did. And hopefully we'll be able to explain that as we go along.
So a couple parts to this question. How important were the congressional hearings that they've just been speaking about? And I have for you a little 4-minute video that takes you back to that time and allows you to hear some of what was going on with the commission hearings. You can see how crowded the rooms were.
Is considering paying each survivor $20,000. It will be this country's most expensive apology. But to Japanese Americans, redress means much more than money. The hearings held by the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment in 1981 set the redress movement in motion. Testimony ranged from the hesitant.
A few weeks ago, I had no intention of testifying. I'm a private person and a very nervous one at the moment.
To the bold.
A joint resolution of Congress simply will not do it for me. Neither will a public apology by the President, nor will a declaration of February 19th as a national holiday, nor will a commemorative stamp. The form of redress must take the form of the traditional Anglo-Saxon expression of correcting a wrong, and that is monetary compensation.
I was angry at my country for confining me to a compound like a criminal. We all suffered humiliation in a concentration camp with barbed wire, with sentries that threatened to shoot me at one time if I ventured past the fence to retrieve a softball.
Congressman Robert Matsui was an infant when his family was confined at Tule Lake near the California-Oregon border.
One thing that my parents tell me is the total lack of privacy, the fact that there was just no privacy, no place to get away. One room, housed 3 generations in a family, usually the grandparents, the parents, and the children. The fact that everything was done in a communal fashion, be it bathing or be it eating.
When I learned that the War Department had determined that the registration and the answering of the loyalty questionnaire by draft age Nisei were not compulsory, that the threats of severe penalties had been a mistake and unwarranted. All those years thinking I had done wrong.
And I don't think there's anything worse than to be accused of being disloyal. I mean, we have capital punishment for people that are disloyal to our country. It's probably the worst, most heinous crime a person can commit. That is, being disloyal to your country, your own people, essentially. And here they were potentially accused of that without any charges against them, without any basis, because of their race.
In the end, not a single act of sabotage or spying was proven against them. But 3.5 years of incarceration had taken their toll.
No, I don't think anybody who has been in an internment camp really recovers from that experience.
For many, this was the first time they had confronted the pain they had buried.
You can see people trembling and shaking as they're making their testimony. And sitting in the audience, you're sitting next to a wife while her husband's testifying, and she's saying very softly to her friend, "Kiyoshi's never cried before. I've never seen Kiyoshi cry. He didn't cry at his father's funeral."
Japanese Americans, in some ways, had been emotionally imprisoned by the fact that they could not release, or they could not really let go of their true feelings, because they had to spend so much time and energy rebuilding their lives.
The reparations issue would later haunt one of the commissioners. Congressman Dan Lundgren opposed monetary compensation for Japanese Americans. An Asian American outcry encouraged the state Senate to reject his nomination for state treasurer. Last Thursday, the California Supreme Court agreed. Lundgren was out.
Yeah, I mean, I think they were critical. This was the chosen direction for the Japanese American Citizens League. I think part of it too had to, but the charge of the commission, incidentally, was that they were to investigate the facts and circumstances surrounding the issuance of Executive Order 9066, and then to issue findings and recommendations to Congress. Part of it too was to try to get, as commissioners, individuals who had a great deal of credibility among the public, to try to get really a panel of distinguished Americans to serve in that capacity. I remember that time, and Ray has talked about this fellow John Tateishi, who was the chairperson for the National Redress Committee, and then became actually part of the staff of the JACL as the director for the Redress campaign. And so I remember a lot of conversations with John, and one of the people that we had talked about was Arthur Goldberg, who was a former Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Secretary of Labor, very, very distinguished background. And I remember John had sent a letter to Mr. Goldberg asking him whether or not he was interested in serving on the commission. And John got a letter back from Mr. Goldberg saying basically that he was very, very aware of what had happened to Japanese Americans during World War II, but he says, I'm very well known to the president, and if he chooses to designate me, he will do so. We don't need a letter. So it was kind of interesting in terms of a response. It ended up that the panel was made up of this Daniel Lundgren, who was then a representative from the state of California. Senator Edward Brooke was a member of that. Arthur Fleming, who was the former chairperson of the United States Commission on Civil Rights, Representative Father Robert Drinan was a member. So the list of those who served on that panel was distinguished indeed, and I think it was very, very important that we had such a illustrious kind of a panel. I guess the other parts of this, and I just kind of wanted to comment a little bit on what you saw here in terms of these hearings. One of the things that the commission did was to have hearings around the country. They held one in Chicago, they held one in New York, they held them on the West Coast in Seattle, in San Francisco, in Los Angeles. They also held 2 hearings in Washington, D.C., where former federal officials who were connected, if they were still living, connected to the decision-making and the administration of those internment camps who came to Washington to actually testify as well. I think that having these hearings around the country, first of all, had a very profound effect on the community. As was mentioned up here, a lot of the emotion, a lot of the experiences really had been bottled up for many, many years, for decades. In fact, my parents, for example, never really talked to me about what had happened to them during the war. And so with all these bottled up emotions and now an opportunity, and this is one of the things we worried about, if given that opportunity, would these folks come out and talk about their experiences in a public forum that everybody was listening to, that the media was attending and so forth. But I'll tell you, by God, they did come out, and they just poured their hearts out about their experiences, and you saw there that there was a lot of emotion that was expressed. I think it was a very cathartic experience, I think, for many who had gone through that experience, and I think it really was a watershed in terms of our own community in their really facing that situation and their history very directly. But I think, too, that it had a profound effect on the commissioners. And once the lobbying effort got underway in Congress, those testimonies had a very, very strong impact on legislators as well. I remember in helping to put together the hearing in Chicago, we just didn't know what to expect, and we had 2 days of hearings actually in Chicago, but it was so gratifying to see folks come out, but then to listen to the stories, it was just such a compelling and even as I think of it today, it was something that I certainly had not expected. In fact, when the commission finally issued its report, approximately a year and a half later, they titled it "Personal Justice Denied." They didn't call it the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. They saw it as an individual and personal tragedy, and so they linked that into their title.
I think that's an important point, because what was the strategy? What should they do, and how should they go about doing it? And one of the things they said was, don't make this incarceration kind of a thing, but justice denied. And so that sold the public and sold the Congress, because it was easy to tell people, when you get your constitutional rights taken away, how important that is to everyone, because that applies to everybody. And so that was one of the strategies in this campaign. The other thing is, how critical was the hearing? The hearing was very, very critical, as Bill mentioned. That educated not only the public, but also the Congress people that we had to convince. And as we go along, we'll go into this, what happened in the transition and how things changed that was favorable. And as I started reading this thing, I didn't really pay too much attention to this thing until you brought this up, and I thought, I got to do a little study on this thing. And I was amazed to find out all the things I didn't know that happened, all the little things that built up to the passage of this law. And I think that part was so critical, and the time factors of things happening, both intentional, unintentional, and the unintended consequences of some things that took place just helped everything. And, I look at this and I think, gosh, everything just kind of fit in. One piece after the other. And the sequence just fit in, just as if, you had planned it and it just kind of turned out. But it was not planned. It just happened. And the happening was just so fortuitous for the Japanese community and for the passage of this that, I'm just still amazed. I think about it and I go, how could this ever have happened? And I see the slow building up. And, Bill will continue to talk on this, but it's just amazing and incredible story.
What role did you and or your organizations play in the movement toward acquiring a government apology and the reparations?
Yeah, I've worked for the Japanese American Citizens League for about 30 years now. And during that period of time when the organization did go down this path of putting legislation in Congress, first to establish the redress legislation, or the commission legislation, and then the actually putting a bill in Congress. So I was actually very fortunate to be involved, and a lot of what I did was actually in the Midwest, just trying to encourage folks to contact their members of Congress and so forth. One of the things I remember, was in working with the kind of like the national campaign, we decided that we had to find a way to gather information anecdotally about the various legislators in Congress. And so what we did was we bought a computer, and this is like back in 1980. And I mean, these are big clunkers, right, back during that period of time. And we have these things on these, these big floppy disks. I don't know, some of you may remember them, these like 4 or 5 inch floppy disks. But in any event, we put together a database, which we thought was a big deal at the time. It's not so much now, but we had to find a way, to gather the information on these members of Congress, because we would have folks write to their or constituents write to their members of Congress, and we just had to find a way to kind of organize all of this information so that we could pass it along to someone like Norm Mineta in the House or Dan Inouye or Spark Matsunaga in the Senate, so they could kind of do follow-up work with their colleagues to try to close the deal on some of this. So a lot of what we were trying to do then was to just really a lot of the grassroots organizing and grassroots support out there for the issue. I remember during that period of time that and I was a lot younger than I am today, but I couldn't at that time imagine a prospect more exciting or more important really than what we were working on at that time. And I have to tell you that it was a campaign where we didn't know what the end result of it was going to be. I mean, there were times when we felt we didn't feel that this thing was moving forward, and because it did take quite a long time once the bill got into Congress. It took 3 sessions of Congress actually for action to finally occur on it. But I think in the depths of all of that, it was we just really didn't think at times that any of this was going to take place. I remember talking to John Tateishi very, very early on. And he was as much as he tried to be very, very positive about this, it was just, I think most people just thought it was going to be a long shot at best, but it was something important enough to be involved in and to at least give it, the best shot that we could. So the involvement I had in it was simply through the organization I happened to work for.
I think in the community, the feeling was kind of divided. I talked to a lot of people, and they were kind of neutral, and I come from Utah, which is a lot of Mormons there, and we had a lot of Japanese Mormons, and they did not want to sort of raise issues that they thought was kind of dead, and bringing this up they thought would be very, very harmful. And so Utah being sort of a conservative kind of a state, and you have a conservative state with Japanese who happen to be more conservative than conservative people when you get in that climate, because they just don't want to raise any hassle, I don't know around here, but you go to places like Utah where we don't have a lot, but we do have a number of them. And those people are very sensitive to being subject to any kind of exposure to anything that would be critical of them. And so trying to convince them was very hard. And then there are those that felt that there should be some kind of a redress because, after all, we suffered a lot, and we should be redressed for that suffering. And one of the things that happened was that they used to use the word reparations at first, and they says, reparation is for war damages, to pay someone back, and usually it's the losing country that pays the winning country. And here, we're asking not for that. We're citizens that have been denied rights. What we want is redress. And so the emphasis was on redress, which really helped in terms of the language, and for the Congress people to go up to their fellow Congress people to talk about redress of denial of rights. And so I think in all the local communities, they face the same problem that we did in Utah, trying to convince people that we should get anything. And why should they apologize? Why should they give redress? And they identified us as the enemy, and that was one of the problems. Well, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Our children were killed, and they said, you're sort of responsible. And we were trying to tell them, we're American citizens. We're born here. We have never even been back to Japan before, and we're just like you. We have the same rights that were denied. And so convincing them of that was really hard. And still, people, even to this day, bring up that argument of, you bombed Pearl Harbor, and, a lot of our citizens were killed. And as if we were the direct result of what happened, and we were not. And so to convince them of that was very, very hard.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And it was there were members of Congress who, on the floor of Congress, when this bill came up for debate, who actually said that they were, they talked about their relatives serving in World War II in the Pacific, and the atrocities and all of the horrors of war that they had experienced. And so it's trying to educate folks, as Ray said, that we're talking about Japanese Americans, those who were here, and trying to make the distinctions. And it was a very, very difficult challenge. And you can imagine that just trying to, it's just not trying to convince members of Congress, but really you're trying to convince everyone you can out there. You have to get public support for all of this. So it's just a massive, massive education effort.
For the redress and the reparations. You had to think strategically, and there are a number of students here from history or political science or other areas. Things don't happen accidentally. So what had to be done? How did you have to think differently in order to get Congress to move ahead?
Yeah, I think part of it, it came down even to trying to determine what the title of the legislation, for example, would be. It ended up being called the Civil Liberties Act. There were some who said that, well, why don't we just call this Japanese American Redress Act, something like that. But it became very important to try to be sensitive to what the thinking was in Congress and what they would be persuaded by. I think among the Democrats in Congress, the path wasn't as difficult. But on the Republican side, it was more difficult. Dan Lundgren, who was seen in that video, was one of the actual, ardent opponents of individual compensation. He actually served on this federal commission as well. And how do you convince a guy like that? Well, you have to make a different kind of an argument. And it had to be based, we felt, in the Constitution and the denial of rights, civil liberties. And that's how the title for the act came about. Also, too, when the legislation was introduced, it was, on the House side, it was H.R. 442. 442 being the number of that regiment during World War II that brought, so much glory, really, to the Japanese American community, who eventually that unit became the most highly decorated unit in American military history. So trying to use, little kinds of things like that to try to send signals. Beyond that, it really became a campaign to try to acquire the votes of individual members, and to do that, and I think we'll go into this a little bit later on, but it was trying to get just garner constituent support, and trying to look at this thing from on an individual basis, and trying to figure out what buttons do we push in order to get this particular member of Congress, or who do you not waste time on, that sort of thing. So really it became a strategy of personalities in many ways to try to determine, how is it that you persuade a particular member to come across. We knew what the numbers were. We had to get 218 votes in the House, 51 in the Senate. And so we had targets that we were going after. The first session of Congress that this bill was introduced was in 1983. Didn't get very far. Same thing happened in in the next session in 1985, and it wasn't until the third session that was introduced in 1987 that the bill finally passed, both on the House side and on the Senate side. But I'm going to kind of turn it over to Ray here, and then I'll come back and talk a little bit more about some of the details about the strategy.
Yeah. The strategy really kind of evolved because Daniel Inouye was already in the Senate, and he was very powerful. But he was not too keen on doing anything because of the sensitive nature of this. in 1970, let's see, I think it's 76, Norman Mineta was elected. So now we have two people in Congress, whereas we only had one before. And you're going to see how having a number of people elected to Congress made a big difference. After Norman Mineta came Spark Matsunaga. I don't know if you ever met Spark, but he's a Hawaiian. And you know Hawaiians are very, very open, and they welcome everybody. So he knew all the Congress people, the senators. He was very, very his personality is very, very, one that makes people say, hey, this is really a nice guy. So he established this personality with all the other senators. So they all liked him. And Daniel Inouye was a very powerful senator at the time. Then along comes Hayakawa, which created a real problem for us. And at our convention in 1978 in Salt Lake City, I was the co-chairman of the convention, and I had not known the big problem that we were having with Hayakawa, although I knew that he was very conservative. And then later I find out that, boy, we made a big, big mistake, because he came out in the open saying, I oppose this thing, Oh, boy, that really surprised me. But, the national people knew about it. And at the national convention, you have this seat where we have everybody seated. The people from Southern California that knew about him, no one showed up, so there was a big empty spot there at the convention. But after that, we got Honda elected in the House, and then Matsui. And between all the congressmen, like I was saying, the things started aligning one after the other. We had only one, now 2, 3, 4. Then Pat Saiki, who is a Republican from Hawaii, was elected. So that brought someone from the opposite side on our side. So all of these things, just so lucky. And I tell you, I look at this and I cannot believe how lucky we were on the sequence of things that happened. And that congressional composition made a world of difference, because they were all established and they become very well respected in their respective, houses and the Senate. So that's one of the things that really, really helped us, was the election of these people, plus going from Democrat to Republican to Democrat again made a big difference in both the House and the Senate.
Yeah, this is also a period of time where the country was suffering some economic distress as well during the 1980s. This is the Reagan years. And this piece of legislation, it was estimated to be about a $1.5 billion bill. I guess in today's terms, maybe that doesn't sound like a lot. Back then, it sure seemed like a lot, And then when you talk to legislators, I mean, they just kind of shook their heads at all of this too. In fact, that was used by the Republican side as one of the arguments against, just in terms of fiscal responsibility. I think the argument went something like, if you've got so much of the pie here and you put $1.5 billion into compensating for this injustice that took place decades ago, then you're going to be taking away from certain social programs today. In fact, that was one of the arguments that Dan Lundgren was making. So it was something that we had to try to overcome. The other types of, I think, arguments that were out there were that somehow these payments would debase the whole acknowledgement that Congress was going to make in terms of saying that what took place back in 1942 was wrong. And one of the other arguments beyond that was that this might set some sort of a precedent for other groups seeking justice as well. So all of that kind of played into the mix. I think, as Ray said, it's a matter of, on the one hand, there were 4 Japanese American members of Congress, and I guess if you look at the situation, I guess there's, Congress can be an insider's game, at some point, so that you have a guy like Senator Inouye, who's extremely influential that he could pretty well wrap up the Senate. But it just wasn't just Dan that did it. Spark Matsunaga actually was the one who took the lead role on the Senate side, and he made it, I think, his life's mission actually, to go out and talk to every member, 100 members of the Senate, to try to persuade them. And he did an awfully good job of it, because I forget the count, but it was close to 80 votes that he finally got. The House side was much more difficult for some of the reasons that I mentioned. I think, too, as Ray says, I mean, you've got to be a little bit lucky at these things as well. Because you can't, planning's great. You've got to have the planning. But sometimes you just have to be lucky. One of the reasons why the bill was stalled during those first two sessions of Congress was that in one of the subcommittees in the Judiciary Committee in the House, it was chaired by this fellow named Sam Hall, a Texan. Sam Hall was ardently opposed to the legislation. As long as Sam Hall sat as chair of that Judiciary Subcommittee, the bill was going nowhere. And so it just stalled. That's why it stalled for two sessions. What happened, and I think this was probably in 1986 or 1987, Sam Hall was appointed as a federal judge. So Sam Hall, all of a sudden, is out of the way. And Barney Frank is appointed to replace him. And you all know that Barney Frank is, one of the more progressive, or perhaps the most progressive and thoughtful members of the House. Made it, part of his priority to get this legislation through. I should mention, too, that, even before all of this, there were, and this probably goes back to the strategy a little bit, Jim Wright was the House Majority Leader during that period of time, during the 80s. And he was fairly close to Norm Mineta. But the other part of this, I think that's kind of important, is that Jim Wright was a Texan as well. And during World War II, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team had a campaign where they rescued the 36th Texas Battalion. They were called the Lost Battalion. And as a result of that, the members of the 442nd were declared honorary Texans. And Jim Wright remembered all of this. And in fact, Dan Inoue, Spark Matsunaga were members of the 442nd. They were honorary Texans. And so this had a lot to do, too. I mean, it's those kinds of relationships. And so when you have a person who is in a role that Jim Wright was in to sign on, I think he was the very first co-sponsor of the legislation on the House side, it produced a great impact because he's the leader, and hopefully if you are the leader, you have followers, and so that's, of course, that's how that all works. So it was these relationships, and that's not to discount, too, I think, the work out there in the community at the grassroots level, because there were times when there were members of Congress that had to hear from constituents, even if it was a letter or two or a phone call or two. They get persuaded by those sorts of things. The threshold for persuading members, at least back then, wasn't very high. If they got 20 letters, and if they were written letters, that was probably even better. That it would go a long way in persuading them. So that there were some that that were persuaded simply because of the constituent pressure that was placed as well. But as I mentioned, you had to be lucky along the way as well. So when Barney Frank assumed the chairmanship of that House subcommittee, things went through, and finally the House, it did get to the House floor, and when it got to the House floor, it passed.
Yeah. Barney Frank happened to be the first openly gay legislator elected to Congress. And Norman Mehta made a phone call to him and said, I'd like to have an appointment with you. Barney Frank replied, if you're talking about this bill, he says, you don't have to have an appointment with me. I'm for you. So that's how he was, and it really helped in terms of the alignment. And, I can't overemphasize how Congress changed from Democrat to Republican to Democrat again. And those people that became chairs of all these very important committees had to be the ones that supported it. And so it was a lot easier to get this bill passed. It's hard to get it out of the committee. And they were able to get it out of the committee. And then this grassroots support that you talked about is critical, because congressmen like to hear from their constituents. And so we had as many people as possible in different organizations all over the United States, not just Japanese American, but we had the NAACP, the Hispanic group. We had all these groups that contacted their respective representative, and that swayed a lot of the people in Congress, plus the Japanese American Congress people that established a reputation of being very, very hardworking and doing the right thing. And so when they were contacted by their fellow congressmen to support this, they were very, very receptive to that.
Impact other initiatives directed at Congress for reparations or for redress with other groups of people?
Since the passage of redress legislation, I know our organization has been contacted by African American groups having to do with trying to remedy some of the historic injustices related to slavery. I guess the direction that we've tried to provide on that is because we see that as an issue that has even now much education about it to be done, that perhaps a commission approach might be a good way to go. And I believe that John Conyers from Michigan has done just that in recent sessions of Congress. I don't know where it's at right now, but I think that would probably be the most prominent example of a similar kind of an issue that has come to the fore. One other story, I just thought of something that I'd kind of like to recount, having to do with the redress movement. The bill got through Congress. House passed it, Senate passed it. They reconciled the language. It still had to be signed by President Reagan, a Republican president who I think at that time was still under the impression that the incarceration was a situation of protective custody of a group of people during World War II. And this was, the story is interesting because, Reagan was kind of thought kind of anecdotally in many ways in terms of stories and that sort of thing. And during World War II, he presided over a medal ceremony where a Japanese American killed in action. His mother was going to receive a decoration, and Ronald Reagan was present at that medal ceremony, and made remarks to the effect that the blood that runs on the battlefield is all of the same color, that kind of thing. And we had a person who was involved in the legislative campaign during that time. His name was Grant Uji-Fusa. Grant had a lot of very, very strong contacts to the Reagan administration. He had gone to school actually with a lot of these, a lot of the folks who actually were in the administration at that time, and he just kept trying to find a way to get word to Reagan, about what he ought to do when this bill came before him. And so Grant was an editor in New York, and he had edited a book by Tom Kean, who was then the governor of New Jersey, and it so happened that Tom Kean was going to be riding in a limousine with Reagan and would have like 35 or so minutes with him. And so Grant, just kind of hurriedly met with Kean, and Kean promised him that he would really pitch this whole redress thing and to try to convince him that he ought to sign the legislation. And what Kean did was to recall for him that story about how he had been the person who had presented this medal to this mother who lost her son during the war, and he was apparently caught up in the emotion of it all, and at some point thereafter, that seemed to have been the thing that actually convinced him. So, a lot of this is just, there's I guess that could be kind of seen to be a strategy, at least a White House strategy on this. But sometimes, it's not just sometimes emotion drives these things, and that probably is what drove Reagan on this particular issue.
Yeah. Along the same line on that story, he was denied burial in the community. He had won the second highest award given by the military. And General Joseph Stilwell, who's a legend in the South Pacific, heard about that, personally came to that town to make sure that he would be buried in that where he wanted to be buried. And that made a world of difference, because these people didn't realize how important this particular incident was. And when a four-star American general comes all the way from the Pacific and flies into that small town and tells them, hey, you guys got to hear the story right, and they changed their mind. And so that was part of that. And then I just want to, it hasn't quite got anything to do with this directly, but the commission staff that helped get all this material together so that the Congress people would know what was going on. There's an Aiko Herzik Yoshinaga who did a lot of critical research. And there were 10 final copies of the final report, Japanese Evacuation from the West Coast, 1942, of General DeWitt. And Secretary McCloy got a hold of that and made about 50 different changes to that report. They thought he had ordered all 10 reports to be destroyed, burned. And so they thought it was all burned. Aiko just happened to go a little bit early to the guy that was supposed to show her this report, that there was nothing there. And she just happened to look at one of the desks of the secretary, and she sees this report. And, she couldn't believe what she saw, because it was one remaining report that they thought was destroyed that wasn't. And in that, it had the original report, which showed that the Congress was deceived and the president was deceived. And because of that, they had the report from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Naval Intelligence that said, hey, don't worry, there are not going to be any problems. There's no espionage. It's directly in that report. And that was taken out. So the impression that Congress and the president had was this impression that there was danger and that these people had to be taken away because there was espionage and sabotage possible. And that report indicated that it wasn't so. That destroyed the argument of the people who said that that there was danger, and that made a big difference in the Supreme Court decision.
Right.
We're a university, students, and faculty members. So what types of resources might be available for faculty and students to use in learning more about this whole initiative? There are a few that we put up here for you. There's the whole Civil Liberties Act of 1988. It's very key for you to look up and read what it actually said about the information and the actual report written by the commission was a separate piece, a separate document that gives the recommendation. Picture of President Ronald Reagan signing the act with members of the movement who really were instrumental in helping to get it passed. There are letters that are out there, formal apologies. Reparations piece, there was money that was given to those who were affected, but there were also letters that were written, letters of apology from the President's office. And for some members of people who were the former internees in the camps, this was probably the most important piece. The letter was the most important piece. Before you go, we want to ask if there are any questions that you might have for our guests. And after we're done here, we have some reception at the back of the room. So, any questions that you might have for them?
I wonder if anybody knows what percentage of all Japanese Americans, citizens at that time, were interred, and then what percentage of those people actually received redress?
Yeah, I think there were 120,000 that were incarcerated, and at the time that bill was passed, they thought there were they had a guess, 60,000 that were still alive, and that's how they came up with the amount, $1,300,000,000 or something like that.
But all of those people would have been from the West Coast, but were there Japanese Americans elsewhere in the country that were interred, or were they just ignored, or?
It was just the West Coast that were brought in, plus individuals that came up from Latin America. The two governments made a deal and brought up those of Japanese descent from Peru and from a number of other countries in South America, and they were brought to the United States and put in Department of Justice camps. So part of the amended legislation enabled some of those individuals to receive reparations because they were sort of in a quandary. So they were brought up here by the U.S. government and the Peruvian government and other governments in South America, wanted them out of their country. They brought them to the United States because there were camps here. Put them in camps, but when the camps were ended, they didn't have passports. They couldn't go back home. They couldn't stay here. There were a lot of different concerns with that group.
Were they compensated even though they were not U.S. citizens?
Eventually there was an agreement. Well, actually, there was actually a suit that was brought first, and then finally the government, the Justice Department, did settle with them, allowing them, I believe, $5,000 in compensation for those who wanted to take it. There were some who didn't, who felt that because Japanese Americans had been compensated in the amount of $20,000 that there was not equity involved here, so that in fact that still goes on. I mean, there is a bill in well, I don't know if it's in this current session of Congress, but there has been a Japanese Latin American redress bill. They call it their campaign for justice, so that's an ongoing and unresolved part of all of this still today.
Could you speak to the ways that in the community, how did they deal with the psychological, the spiritual healing aspect of this?
Yeah. This really was a tremendous, what would I say now, activity that really consolidated the Japanese community. And before this time, they were very hesitant to talk about it because they felt that they were sort of convicted without any kind of charge, and that they were sort of criminals like, and the Japanese always had this idea of not trying to make a big deal out of anything like this, and so they're very quiet. Now they had this chance to express their feelings, and it really came out, and it solidified the whole community, and it was sort of a healing process that would never have taken place had this not taken place. And so it had a real positive effect, and then it energized the younger generation, which we really wanted to let the younger people know what happened, and the parents would not talk about it. But with these hearings and all these facts being brought out, they finally realized that there was really a tragedy that took place, and that they have to continue on the legacy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of surprising that psychiatrists' offices around the country weren't filled, with people Japanese Americans as a result of all of this. I think as portrayed in that clip, that these commission hearings that were held really became a way for a lot of folks to really vent, their kind of pent-up emotions and frustrations that they had held inside all those years. And I don't think you necessarily had to give testimony for that kind of cleansing to take place, because I think if you were a Japanese American of that age and even just witnessed any of this thing or seeing the news clips and so forth, I think it just went a long way in reconciling a lot of what had taken place. One of the very oftentimes we get requests from schools to talk about this whole episode in classrooms, and what we try to do is to get individuals who were in those camps to appear before students. And invariably, when asked, what was the worst part about all of this, they don't always talk about the physical deprivations and the being confined, that sort of thing, but it was just the whole notion of being betrayed, thinking that they had the same rights as their fellow Americans, but then yet being treated in that manner. One lady, in fact, in Chicago, who we did a visit to a school last week, and she talked about how being a high school senior, and this, she was forced from her home with her parents in the spring of that year, a couple of months prior to her high school graduation. And she talked about how when she was put in what was then called an assembly center, it was one of the stops along the way before they were actually put into the concentration camps. She talked about how some of her high school classmates came out to visit her, and she said it was the most humiliating experience that she had ever had, because her feeling was that if I'm behind this barbed wire, it gives the impression I must have done something wrong. So it was that humiliation and that sense of betrayal that stays with her even to today.
One thing I'd like to do is this book you probably read, and this is probably the best book on the whole process of getting compensation. And I think this resulted, I don't know if you attended or not, but just after the hearings and the bill was signed at UCLA, they gathered everybody that might have been involved in this whole process, and they all kind of had workshops and reported. And this sort of, I think it's sort of a compilation of that, and it has a lot of resources that you could look at the back of what they did. And I started reading this, and I had not read it before, and I probably should have read it a long time ago, but thanks to you, I read this. And it was something I just couldn't put down after I started reading, because I knew all the the cast of characters of people that I had dealt with over the years, and it was just amazing what they were able to accomplish. And if you have a chance, it tells you all the little things that happened that just lined up like the stars, and it just resulted in the passage of this. And the Japanese community was just very, very lucky, very lucky.
Achieving the impossible dream.
Right.
Well, thank you very much all for coming. We really appreciate that, and I really appreciate the two of you coming into Omaha to help inform us more. Thank you.